Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Religious Studies Project and to the first episode of Discourse for this, our incredibly 10th season at the Religious Studies Project. This year, we're having one episode right at the end of each month. Normally, the discussion is going to, in some way, revolve around the theme for those months' episodes. This month's theme was journeys, and we're about to have a journey into the very heart of American politics right now. But first, let me pass over to our guests to introduce themselves. First, I'm going to pass over to Megan.
Oh, hi, I'm Megan Goodwin. I am the Program Director for Sacred Rites, that's WRIDES, which is a loose-funded project that promotes public scholarship on religion at Northeastern University. I'm also the author of Abusing Religion, which is a book that talks about a number of things that are relevant to Q. So thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Let's hear from Savannah next.
Hi, I'm Savannah Finver. I am currently a doctoral student at Ohio State University in comparative studies. My research has primarily focused on religion and politics and law, particularly in the United States. And my master's thesis focused a lot on the Satanic Panic. So talking about Q is going to be very interesting. And thank you very much for having me.
Again, you're welcome. And finally, Jonathon.
Hello, my name is Jonathon O'Donnell. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin and the author of Passing Orders, a forthcoming book this November on demonology and its intersections with American systems of social prejudice.
And if you haven't picked up already, we're talking about QAnon today. Very timely, and I think we're all quite excited to be doing this. But we're going to start with Savannah is going to give us a quick overview and introduction, if by some chance you haven't heard of this QAnon thing. Savannah, take it away.
Sure. So basically, QAnon is a group, mostly internet based, that started primarily online on these anonymous posting websites. So it started out on 4chan. 4chan went down. It moved to 8chan, and now is on a website called 8kun. And the primary function of these websites is for people to be able to post content anonymously. There was a user, going by the name of Q, who was posting basically these kinds of riddles on these websites, riddles and hints, mostly about a conspiracy of deep state, collusion, and the members of this deep state group are said to be performing satanic ritual murders of young children, and drinking their blood, which supposedly has some kind of magical properties. And of course, recently with the rising hashtag of Save the Children, we've seen accusations of pedophilia as well. And Q is kind of a nebulous group. It's often seen as a far-right conspiracy, but what I have gathered in my research is that it doesn't line up particularly with one extreme of the political spectrum or another. It has far more to do. It's far more a pro-Trump group, and since President Trump is not a typical Republican or typical conservative, this group has been attracting folks from all over the political and religious spectrum. Have I left anything substantial out that I should get into?
Just the pizza.
Oh, the Pizzagate. So yes, so QAnon, you probably, if you have heard of this, you've heard this group, you've heard about it through the Pizzagate issue, where there was the claim was that these satanic ritual killings and pedophilia was going on inside of a pizza shop, and so there was a gentleman who went to investigate this pizza shop, and of course he could not turn up any evidence whatsoever of any kind of deep state collusion, of any kind of ritual murder, of any kind of pedophilia or anything like that. But of course, the lack of evidence was not the end of Q, and as we have seen, the conspiracy theories have just continued to grow and to envelope more issues as our current social and cultural climate has changed. So it's definitely encapsulated, COVID-19 and mask issues, and the hashtag the pandemic video, and so we can get into all of that later in our discussion.
The lack of evidence was also not enough to keep him from not shooting into the pizza place. So
right, yes, he did go in armed. Yes.
For those of us who have a background in looking at new religions, especially, or the broader sort of history of 20th century religion, at least, these ideas of pedophile Satanist rings are quite familiar. Maybe Megan, do you want to take this first?
Oh, golly, sure. So we said at the top that we were all excited to be talking about this, and I'm so annoyed. I'm so annoyed that we have to talk about this stupid nonsense. But of course, it's shaping the political landscape, as it has been, you're pointing out, David, for 40 years now. So the short version is that America's satanic panic gets kicked off in the 1980s, largely around anxieties that folks caring for children outside a traditional nuclear family are subjecting them to satanic rituals for unclear but very scary reasons connected possibly to a scheme of global domination aspirations. So we see it early in the 1980s with anxieties around childcare facilities, most famously the McMartin preschool, where the folks who are running the preschool are subjected to the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history, that after a decade turned up no evidence of sexual abuse or ritual activity. Later in the 1980s and then into the early 1990s, we see folks being diagnosed as ritual abuse survivors by a comparatively small group of therapists, social workers who have been trained to look for ritual abuse. So you've got comparatively a handful of folks diagnosing hundreds and hundreds of people, women mostly, middle-class white women mostly, as survivors of ritual abuse. So they're recovering, and you should hear the scare quotes around that, memories about having been subjected to sexual abuse as children, either by their parents or by community members. The tricky thing here is, obviously, we know sexual abuse of children is incredibly common, but also a almost decade-long $1 million investigation by the FBI turned up no evidence that any sort of satanic conspiracy was operating in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. So it is possible that the women who are recovering these memories or being encouraged to recover these memories experienced something, but it is very unlikely to be connected with any sort of global satanic conspiracy, and deeply unlikely to be connected to John Podesta's polenta recipe. So,
something that's quite interesting is that the classic SRA scare in the 80s and 90s was also transatlantic. There was the McMartin trial in the States, but the Orkney trial was happening at the same time, and it similarly didn't produce any lasting convictions. But what strikes me as another interesting parallel is that in both cases, whilst it's clearly we now talk about the satanic ritual abuse scare as a classic kind of case of conspiracy thinking. But at the time, it was something that was, in law, and police officers were being trained, and there were special seminars for lawyers and policymakers where people with extremely dubious credentials, often coming from a highly evangelical background, were teaching police officers how to spot the evidence of these satanic religions, which simply didn't exist in the form that they were imagining. And here we again have something which straddles a sort of the kind of popular conspiracy stuff that we saw, the stuff that the X-Files was talking about, but also involves people in government.
Well, that's a really important point. I think folks assume that satanic panic or satanic ritual abuse concerns were exclusively religious or limited to religious communities, but they weren't. This was incredibly mainstream. The chapters that I work on satanic panic in my book look at the ways that ostensibly secular organizations and institutions like social work, like law enforcement, like the courts are adopting a really religious script in these, again, supposedly secular spaces. And the piece about the evidence is important too, specifically because I can't speak to the Orkney case, but with the American cases, people were convicted for, honestly, collectively centuries on specious, if not no evidence. Some of these folks are just now getting out of jail. Some of them are still serving terms. And we still have laws on the books in several states specifically related to satanic ritual abuse, despite the fact that the phenomenon has been pretty thoroughly debunked outside conservative evangelical circles.
There's historical links. A lot of the same people who were involved in the policing of satanic ritual abuse during the 90s were also involved in the recent. We had a little satanic ritual abuse scare in 2014, 2015, based around Hampstead, and it's exactly the same people, and those people now are also involved in the Save the Children marches that were happening in the US and in Britain just this weekend past, I think. Savannah, any thoughts there on connections with satanic ritual abuse?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting that we're seeing, as Megan already pointed out, that we're seeing kind of a repeat of this rhetoric kind of bouncing up again. I think what's really interesting to point out is that the satanic panic popped up at the end of the 1960, 1970 countercultural movements here in the United States. And here now, again, worldwide, globally, we're having another cultural crisis in terms of COVID-19. It's changed the way that we've, looked at things. It's changed the way that we're behaving in our everyday life. And I think although I am disappointed that we're having to address this again in some ways, I think it's not altogether surprising that this same discourse, I think, is popping up now around this ritual satanic abuse. That I think this is a time of great fear and unknowns. So I think it's again not altogether surprising that we're seeing a revival of this kind of rhetoric. What is concerning in some regards is that now it's focused more on political actors and political parties. And so we're seeing, in some cases, evidence of violence and, facing towards, political actors, and particularly the Democratic Party as Trump's chosen nemesis. So,
yeah. I mean, the political aspect isn't new either. We get Jesse Helms entering an entire transcript of, oh, Lord, I think it was the 2020 episode on satanic ritual abuse into the congressional record before he gets the entire United States Senate to agree not to fund the forces of darkness. Like that is in the transcripts. It's so trippy. But it also, I think, speaks to this weird space of the devil / Satanism / satanic panic occupying a weirdly secular space. Like none of the members of Q are doing like a Ku Klux Klan thing of saying we all need to be good white Protestant men. But you do have this united force against like evil and the forces of darkness that works in a very religious framework, but doesn't espouse any one particular like religious identity. I know Jonathon's kind of our demonology specialist. I'm wondering if he could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, I was going to bring him in, especially as we get into the more sort of, what's the word, sort of spiritual warfare aspects of it, which are very interesting to me.
Okay, well, I can talk about that. I mean, I guess that's a kind of opening point to go back to a kind of point that Megan made, is that the idea of satanic ritual abuse like never went away from a lot of conservative evangelical circles. It's been a pretty, if not prominent, like at least present aspect in a lot of the conservative evangelical discourse ever since. And there's a large overlap between Q and general discourse of the spiritual warfare. For people who don't know what spiritual warfare is, spiritual warfare is a framework that develops mostly in Pentecostal and charismatic evangelical subcultures. That the idea that demons are active, malevolent forces in both history and contemporary society, and they can be fought primarily through kind of militant forms of prayer, some weaponized prayer structures, but also through, for some, through kind of direct political activism, through taking control of specific regional or local bodies and purging them of the forces of darkness, essentially. But there's a general big overlap between that kind of framework and Q, both kind of in terms of specific figures. Like one of the prominent kind of Q evangelists, I guess you could call them, is David Hayes, more popularly known as Praying Medic, who was very, very involved in spiritual warfare communities. Mark Taylor, who wrote The Trump Prophecy, which was developed into a movie by Liberty University, has kind of pivoted to Q-related discourses kind of in the years since. Only this year, several actual Q drops have referenced Q drops being the statements that Q puts out on anonymous forums, referencing things like the full armor of God, reference particularly derived from Ephesians, like phrases that are very, very prominent within spiritual warfare communities. Yeah, so that's the general overlap that you'll find there.
I wanted to pick up on something you said there about things coalescing around the Q narrative, because this is something that I find very interesting. My doctoral research was on conspiracy theories in the lead up to 2012. It wasn't specifically about 2012, but it was about these communities that were kind of post-New Age. And I noticed this pattern of these, every so often this millennial narrative would appear that everything kind of coalesced around. And even though it never, like 2012, for instance, or, the New Age in its original kind of late 50s, early 60s form, they never really had a firm central idea. It was more of just an idea that was loose enough that you could attach almost anything to it. And things got drawn in and it became more complex, but also slightly more solid. And then at a certain point, it kind of climaxes, whether through a sort of failure to, if it's specific enough, like 2012, it ended very quickly. Whereas in the New Age, it kind of dissipated out and became more sort of post-millennial. But I think we're seeing another example of this here, that, there are these increasingly kind of evangelical terms and ideas appearing in the Q material, but there's also stuff about dolphins and crystals and the sort of stuff that we would normally associate with the more sort of left-leaning millennial narratives. And I think that's another example of how understanding this longer history of 20th century religion sheds light on something like QAnon.
Well, and the way that they operationalize and instrumentalize children as well, right? The original Satanic Panic was so compelling beyond Christian forums and communities because we get this appeal to believe the children and save the children. And we're seeing similar rhetoric deployed now, really, again, all over the political spectrum, because you have Q folks teaming up with organizations like Operation Underground Railroad, glomming on to popular liberal causes like anti-sex trafficking, which don't necessarily talk to sex workers, understand how sex work works. And you've got folks like, seriously, Ashton Kutcher putting millions of dollars behind anti-trafficking legislation and operations that ultimately harm sex workers, don't save trafficked children, and feed into this kind of millennial sexual depravity. We need to get in there and save the kids thing. So you get nice white ladies who don't necessarily think of themselves as religious or as conspiracy theorists showing up for anti-trafficking events, not knowing that they're being organized by Q. And by the end, they're shouting like, where we go one, we go all. It's truly bizarre. I was talking to some folks who work on Mormon fundamentalism on Twitter, and Christina Rossetti was saying that she was so confused to see some of the same rhetoric around child trafficking and Q, whether or not they recognized it, show up on like conservative Mormon Facebook pages and Mormon fundamentalist Facebook pages. So you've got folks all over a religious spectrum and all over a political spectrum glomming onto this, I think largely in part because it's hard to argue against we want to protect and save children, even while we as a society are massively failing children. We know that sexual abuse of children is rampant. It is an epidemic that we are not addressing, but we sure are turning out in droves to yell about imaginary conspiracies and children being trafficked through the basement of a pizza place in DC.
Right, where the same crowds, though, are not gathering to protest the Catholic Church, which has been indicted, hundreds of times now.
Yes, as well it should.
Yes, absolutely. And the claim to be seeking to protect the children, there have been no children saved. There's been no trafficking uncovered. It has failed, as you say, utterly to do this.
Well, and I mean, this is indicative of a larger problem about the way that we think about cults, right? We focus on these minority or these marginalized groups. We assume that they are putting children at risk because they do religion differently or they do sex differently. I'm thinking here specifically of Mormon fundamentalists. And the practice of doing sex differently becomes evidence for abuse. So these folks practice polygamy. Let's send in tanks and take away all their kids is a thing that happened in 2008 in Texas. But at the same time, David, as you raise, we are not sending tanks. We are not sending armed SWAT teams into the parish parking lots of your local Catholic church, despite the fact that we have evidence of massive and institutionalized child abuse for decades, if not centuries.
And concerted efforts to cover it up.
Precisely so.
It's very interesting. Jonathan, were you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say, because you brought up the Catholic Church, there was a Q-related protest here in Dublin a few days ago. And despite the critical role that the abuse scandals in the Catholic Church have played within Irish public discourse over the last sort of 3 decades, that wasn't a feature at all of the Q protests. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
They seemed very unconcerned with that and more concerned with like nebulous conspiracies around particularly like gay members of the Irish Parliament.
Well, it's so staggering because, again, like it's not as though there is not evidence of child trafficking directly tied to the Trump administration. But we're going to assume, we here being Q members or adherents or however you want to think them, that he is in some way using the deep state to combat child trafficking while he's saying that Ghislaine Maxwell, he wishes her well. It's just utterly baffling.
Yep, and likewise with the royal family here as well. There's not a lot of press outrage about that one, surprisingly.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on something, another aspect of how I think a religious studies perspective can be quite enlightening here. So no pun intended. It's this idea of belief. So we're talking about demonstrations where people with very different and sometimes incompatible religious and political positions are gathering together to protest, particular, I'll call it particular issues, for want of a better way of saying it. And when these are reported by the particularly left wing press in the US, who are very angry about the idea of Trump full stop, these are presented as baying crowds of Q people. They've all gone down the rabbit hole and they all completely believe in, QAnon. But of course, we know that belief is much more complicated than that. And whether you ask these people, do you believe such and such? Do you believe in Q? Do you think that, the whole narrative that we've built about what Q is? I doubt that we'd find that many, or I think the majority would probably be a little bit more reluctant to go all in, shall we say.
I mean, ultimately, I don't know that it matters so much. I think the focus on belief it's a Christian instinct and it lingers in the academy, but ultimately I care less about whether or not they fully bought into Q than whether they're showing up in the streets without masks, breathing on each other, and insisting that we save the children in ways that make lawmakers and celebrities pay attention to them, and then act in ways that don't save any children but do actively harm sex workers and minority religions.
All right. No, I agree with you. It's not an issue of caring, I think, but it maybe suggests that the issue here is this underlying belief of secret crowds of the other who are trying to abduct and molest our children, which is something that has a long, long history going at least back to the 80s and probably much longer than that if we take in, the anti-Semitic stuff or the war. Whereas if we look at Q itself, we see this terribly novel thing that's, it's all about politics and it's about people who think that Trump is up to, the 4D chess. But if we actually stop and go, well, do they all believe this? Or actually, is it much more about this other idea of a religious sexual threat, much more vaguely, but much more widespread, then I think it starts to be a little bit more explicable, perhaps.
Yeah, we love to blame other people for sex abuse because it makes it not our fault. This is the argument of my book, honestly, is that we like to find excuses for sex abuse that aren't more powerful people take advantage of less powerful people, including women and children. So if sex abuse is a thing that's done by like a cabal in the basement of a pizza place, it's not our fault, as opposed to like, statistically, we know most kids are likely to be harmed by members of their own family or folks that are known to their families and communities, right? That is our fault. That's on us. That's
Savannah.
harder. That's scarier. Sorry, Savannah. Yeah, please.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think I was just going to say that part of what makes Q so successful, going back to David's idea about how belief plays into this, I think part of what makes Q so successful is that it is so vague in terms of there is no real centralizing structure. Not all adherents believe that Q is they don't all agree about Q's identity. They don't all agree about, the different issues. There are so many nebulous things that Q has come to encompass for people, where it does kind of become, as Jonathon was describing earlier, that just spiritual warfare, good against evil. And, most people experience something like that at some point, where they have causes where, they feel that they can go out, as Megan was just saying, and fight against evil and blame someone else for the evils that have been going on within our culture, because it's far easier to blame others than it is to blame ourselves. But I think that that yes, Q's success has a lot to do with the fact that it doesn't have a centralized, belief system. It doesn't. It's not belief that brings these people together. There's some kind of broader, perhaps faith in Trump, or perhaps disillusionment with the establishment. There's something. It's not quite belief, I think, that makes Q a coherent group, if you can even begin to call it that.
Well, and there's a cognitive dissonance element there as well, right? The harder that folks outside the community push back against this, the more it reinforces that this is important, and that you on the inside of the community are the ones that are really understanding what's going on. We see this with conspiracy theories all the time, which I'm sure David can speak to better than I can.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reinforcement of group identity, and I think the increasing narrative of individualism in the latter half of the 20th century is fed into that. That there's an encouragement to do your own research and think for yourself, which adds to this idea of, well, if I'm getting this much resistance, I must be onto something.
Precisely. Well,
Yeah.
and also all of the information that you have access to is not of equal credibility, but again, the questioning of credibility fades into this: who's really telling the truth, who really has access to this. So.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a much bigger conversation. We probably shouldn't get into it, but we've probably got 10 minutes left. But we're seeing the broader public discourse catch up with the sort of critical theory of what was, the avant-garde of academia in the 40s and 50s is now mainstream. But the problem is that many of the people don't have the critical skills to tell good information from bad information, because education is not as good as it should be. Right. But we'll come back to that another day. What I want to do just now is talk a little bit more about the way that language about religion is playing into the current political discourse. I think it's very interesting. If you read an article on Q from either side, you'll see the opposite side being derided for being a religion or a cult, or the one that's recently appeared, which I'm seeing a lot, is death cult, which I think is the next level up from being a cult. So what's happening here? What does this tell us about the way that people are using the language of religion? Jonathon, let's start with you, because you haven't had a chance yet.
Well, I'm guessing Megan has a lot of feelings about the use of the word cult. One of the things I found really interesting about the discourse is the way that the language around religion serves various degrees of othering to a certain extent. For example, references to Q as a new religion, for example, tends to operate to distance itself from a form of American religion that is heavily white and heavily Christian. It essentially says like the Q is not something that has emerged from pre-existing religious and political frameworks in America. It is quintessentially different. On the other hand, you have people kind of going further and using the cult language around it to be like, no, it's not a religion, it's a cult, or a death cult even. And basically the way that this language tends to operate to present Q as something very unique and very new, in a way that exculpates us, or like normative society in America, from any form of kind of culpability in the underlying frameworks that have caused it to come about in some way.
Mm.
It protects Christianity, certainly.
Yeah.
It allows you to avoid the uncomfortable connections with, the evangelicals. Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, and very specifically, white supremacist Christianity, which is way more mainstream than we like to think that it is.
Definitely. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because even in articles that address the evangelical undertones or overtones and the intersection, will still try and depict Q as something quintessentially different in a lot of ways. And I find that very telling.
Savannah?
Sure. I think it's very interesting because it depends on who you are speaking to, what kind of, as you talk to different adherents, they all have a different perspective as to whether, Q is a cult, a conspiracy theory, a religion. And I think it does show how, as we've already made clear, that these terms like cult and conspiracy, they're often used to delegitimize certain groups. And then when you see people talking about it instead as a religion, it's used, in a sense to legitimize while also distancing itself, as Megan and Jonathan were saying, from mainstream Christianity. So it's kind of like religion, but it's not really like religion. And it's been very interesting for me to see different news casters and reporters, and especially scholars from other fields, trying to grapple with how to classify Q, because it doesn't really seem to fit. As I said before, there's no like consistent unifying belief system or structure or disciplinary, nothing that we're familiar with in terms of mainstream religion. So I think for me, my interest is in the way that different groups of people are struggling to try to define this movement, and it does show kind of what our interests are, whoever's doing the classifying, what their interests are.
Yeah. I saw the term quasi-religion pop up again, which I hadn't seen for many a year. But it was interesting what you said there, Savannah, that it's scholars from other fields largely who are being asked to do this defining, or are taking it upon themselves to do the defining.
Yeah.
As usual, we're not being asked about it.
Right. Exactly.
No matter how much I yell on Twitter, it's so strange. That's actually not fair. I have talked to a number of folks, number of journalists, I should say, who want, because I am semi-infamous for yelling about cults on Twitter, to talk to me about whether or not this is a cult and why they can call it a cult. And almost every time what happens is I spend 45 minutes explaining why I don't think this term works, why I think it's damaging, and the piece will come out and it inevitably uses cult language, and then I get an email from the journalist explaining why they are actually correct to use the term, even though I told them that they were wrong. So,
well, that's slightly more polite than the ones I've done, where they just ignore me, and I might get one line in it somewhere.
No, I mean, I think the short critique, I have a longer critique of cult as a term and as a political tool on my own podcast. So check out Keeping It 101 if you're curious about that. But the really short
Nicely
version,
done.
thank you, little plug there. The short version, let's look at it from three prongs. One, the speaking of it as a cult absolves members, participants of responsibility for their actions, because cult carries with it this connotation of brainwashing, right? So they've been tricked or forced into acting in this way. Oh no, they watched too much Fox News and now they've been programmed. And what you have are adult people making choices to consume false information and act on it. So that's dangerous. Two, the use of the word cult invites state surveillance and state intervention, particularly against marginal and minoritized groups. And then three, largely speaking, the cult v religion distinction that you brought up, Jonathan, is really important, because what it does is let folks who are not specialists in religion say, okay, well, some kinds of religion are acceptable and some kinds are not, but ultimately any religion that gets too different or too out there is dangerous. So we should be scared of religion across the board. This is something we should regulate. This is something that we need to control. And honestly, if you buy into religion at all, you're kind of stupid. This is the Krakauer slide, right? Like all religion is inherently irrational. So it becomes a way for folks who think of themselves as liberal or progressive, ultimately to critique religious folks as being just not as smart, not as politically savvy as the rest of us. And I mean, demographically, we know the folks that are most likely to be religious, at least in the United States, are women, are people of color, and are poor. So it winds up being this racist, sexist, classist critique without taking responsibility for being biased against women, poor people, people of color, queers, etc.
But it also maps onto the left-right paradigm, because you've got, the left. It's largely anti-Trump people who are presenting it as a religion, whereas cult language tends to come more from the right, because
the Atlantic used it. So
yeah. I've seen a few actually. But yeah, I think the other thing that's going on though, as well as in presenting it as a religion, is prior to that you had several years of this discourse about whether Trump was a real Christian, and I'm doing the quote marks, of course. So there's a whole language about the job that religion is doing, and whereas, as you said, cult has these certain connotations. One of the connotations is that it's, there's a bad man who's the leader who brainwashed them all.
Yes.
So it repeats the cult of personality and reminds us again how much of this is being amplified by the people who are writing about Q being very unhappy about the existence of Donald Trump as president.
Yeah. Well, and the suggestion that any of this is new or unique to Trump is just, again, lacking in the historical context for American religions. I have been saying all along that it's dangerous to call them a cult because, again, it suggests that they're new and unconnected to the history of American religion, where honestly, if you look at it, they are a logical, if absurd, conclusion of what the new Christian right was pushing as early as the 1970s. Sexual deviance, we are destroying America. Only folks who are truly committed to a very specific kind of morality that looks an awful lot like conservative evangelical / Catholic sexual morality are truly American.
Jonathan, any last thoughts?
I kind of wanted to touch on the Trump centricity of a lot of the discourse around it, and the way that both QAnon and the discourse about QAnon by critics both tend to feed into the narrative that's been very prominent since Trump's kind of rise, that Trump is an anomaly, that he is outside the system, that he is not in some sense an outgrowth of logical trends either on the right or in American politics broadly. And yeah, both the way that the critics of QAnon and QAnon itself kind of rely on that notion of Trump as the outsider, as the thing that is not a product of a system, but is fundamentally a kind of break with the status quo, whereas he's not in a lot of ways.
No, he's Andrew Jackson 2.0. Come on.
Yeah.
There's nothing new about this.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth pointing out. And I think we've come back to a nice point to end on, which is this note of all of this makes a lot more sense if you have a background in religious studies. So go take religious studies.
Take a class.
Take Religion 101, and if you can't go to a real class, then there's a podcast for that.
There is.
Other than that, though, I'm just going to wrap up by saying thank you to Jonathan, Savannah, and Megan for joining us today for this hastily organized but highly topical discussion. And I thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.